The day a poor black man knocked on the front door of my home and asked for my daughter's hand in marriage, my wealthy friends expected me to throw him out on the spot. He arrived in a worn suit that had clearly seen better decades, driving a pickup truck older than he was, with not a single piece of jewelry on his wrists, not a single brand name stitched across his chest, nothing but quiet confidence sitting behind his eyes like a deep, still lake that no wind could disturb. Everyone in that room, lawyers, business partners, old college friends who had turned their ambitions into empires, they all expected me to choose money over love, prestige over character, the world's definition of success over my own conscience. Instead, I looked that young man in the eye, and I said something that left every person in the room completely silent. My daughter doesn't need a rich man. She needs a good one. None of us realized. Not me, not him, not my daughter, standing in the hallway with her hand pressed over her heart, that this single decision would unravel hidden greed, expose painful family secrets buried for decades, and change the trajectory of every single one of our lives forever. His name was Marcus Webb. He was 31 years old, and he arrived at the door of a home that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime, holding nothing but a firm handshake and a quiet, deliberate kind of dignity that the wealthy often mistake for poverty of spirit. Raymond Caldwell. That was the narrator. My father's name. My name had spent 27 years building a reputation in commercial real estate that made people straighten their posture when he walked into a room. The Caldwell name meant something in this city. It meant a certain kind of Sunday dinner, a certain kind of country club membership, a certain kind of expectation about who sat at the table. Raymond's daughter, Elise, had grown up in that world the way a flower grows in a greenhouse, tended carefully, protected from frost, surrounded by the finest examples of cultivation that money could provide. She was 28, a hospital administrator with a graduate degree, and a warmth in her laughter that her father privately believed was the best thing he had ever helped bring into the world. Everyone who moved in Raymond's social circle had privately placed their bets. Dr. Harmon's son, the Whitfield boy, who had just made partner at his firm. There were options, acceptable ones, respectable ones, ones that came with the right surnames and the right zip codes. Nobody had accounted for Marcus Webb, who had driven 40 minutes across the city in a truck with one working radio speaker and a rear bumper held on with wire, to stand in front of Raymond Caldwell and ask, with complete seriousness, for the hand of his daughter. The living room had been full that afternoon. Raymond had not planned it that way. He had not planned any of it, in truth. A casual gathering of old friends, a Saturday afternoon with good bourbon and familiar conversation, had simply been the stage onto which Marcus had walked without warning. Elise had not told her father he was coming. She had told Marcus that she wanted him to meet her father, and Marcus had decided there was no reason to delay what needed to be said. That directness, Raymond would later reflect, was the first thing he noticed. A man who did not play games with timing. A man who looked at a room full of people who out-earned him by multiples of 10 and did not flinch, did not over-explain himself, did not preemptively apologize for the truck in the driveway or the suit that had been pressed carefully, but could not fully hide its age. Arthur Langley, one of Raymond's oldest friends, and a man who had made a fortune in finance, and never let anyone forget it, was the one who said what several people were thinking. He leaned back in his armchair, looked Marcus up and down the way a man appraises livestock at an auction, and said with a smile that had no warmth in it whatsoever, "Son, do you really think you can take care of Raymond's daughter?" The room went very quiet. Not the good kind of quiet, but the anticipatory kind. The kind that gathers before a crowd watches someone fall. Marcus did not answer Arthur Langley. He did not even look at Arthur Langley. He kept his eyes on Raymond, patient, steady, waiting. And that was when Raymond Caldwell held up one hand and said, in a voice that surprised even himself with its firmness, "Everybody, please be quiet." What Raymond saw when he looked at Marcus Webb was not what the rest of the room was looking at. The others were calculating the truck, the suit, the absence of a watch worth mentioning, the hands that showed years of physical labor in the calluses across the palms. Raymond had once been very good at that kind of calculation himself. But something had shifted in him over the years, some internal instrument that had been recalibrated by loss and regret. And what it registered when it turned toward Marcus was something the room's financial analysis could not measure. He saw the way Marcus stood, not puffed up, not hunched, but level, as though he had made some private peace with exactly how much space he occupied in the world and did not need to borrow any more. He saw the way Marcus's eyes moved, not darting, not calculating the room's exits, not performing, present. The eyes of a man who was exactly where he had decided to be, and who had no intention of pretending otherwise. Raymond had sat across from a great many men in his years of business. He had shaken hands with brilliant men, cunning men, charming men, men who could talk about their quarterly projections with the confidence of prophets. Very few of them had the quality he saw in Marcus Webb in those first 30 seconds, which was the quality of a man who had nothing to prove because he already knew what he was made of. Raymond asked Marcus to sit, and the room rearranged itself around this new gravity. Then Raymond asked the only question that mattered to him in that moment. "Why do you want to marry my daughter?" The room leaned in. Marcus did not rush his answer. He sat forward slightly, his elbows on his knees, and he spoke in a voice that was quiet enough that the room had to be silent to hear it, a fact that Raymond recognized, with some small satisfaction, as an elegant form of control. Marcus said, "I can't promise her a castle. I can't promise her the life she grew up in. I know that. But I can promise her that she will never cry alone. I can promise her that every morning she wakes up next to me, she will know she is the most important person in the room, in whatever room that is." There was a beat of silence, and then someone at the back of the room laughed, a single short sound like a coin dropped on marble. Others joined in, the uncomfortable laughter of people who do not know how to sit with sincerity, who have learned to treat earnestness as naivety. Raymond did not laugh. He sat with those words in his chest like a slow-burning coal, because he recognized them. Not from any book or any speech, but from the hollow space inside himself that had existed for years, the space that had been created by a marriage in which he had provided everything money could build and nothing that silence required. Raymond Caldwell had been a man of great professional accomplishment and a man of considerable personal failure, and nobody in that cheerful, dismissive room knew it as well as he did in that moment. It was Arthur Langley who escalated things, because Arthur Langley had never been a man who could leave well enough alone. He had a son named Derek, 33, handsome in an architectural way, a derivatives trader who wore cufflinks that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Derek had been circling Elise for 2 years with the patient strategy of a man who believed he was the obvious answer to a question she hadn't finished asking yet. Arthur stood up, the way men of a certain vintage stand up when they want to remind a room of their physical authority, and said, "With all due respect, Raymond, Elise deserves better than this. She deserves a man who can give her security. Real security, not promises." Several heads nodded. A woman near the window murmured agreement. The air in the room shifted toward consensus, the way crowds often shift when someone with enough money says something with enough confidence. Marcus sat very still. He did not tighten his jaw. He did not look at the floor. He kept his eyes on Raymond with the same steadiness he had maintained since the moment he walked through the door, and Raymond, watching him, felt something settle into place in his own chest, some old argument reaching its resolution. But before Raymond could speak, Elise did. She had been standing in the doorway of the living room for several minutes, and nobody had noticed her, because rooms full of important people rarely pay attention to the people who actually matter. She stepped forward and said, in a voice that was perfectly steady, "Marcus spent 4 years taking care of his mother when she was sick. He turned down a full scholarship to a business program in Atlanta because she couldn't be left alone. He worked nights at a warehouse and weekends doing construction, and he never complained about any of it, not once, not to me, and not to anyone who would have listened. He didn't talk about what he gave up. I only found out because his mother told me, crying, last Christmas." The room went quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet this time. The laughter had left it. Raymond told Marcus he would give him his answer in private, and he meant it not as a delay, not as a dodge, but as a genuine act of respect. He called Marcus the following Thursday and invited him to dinner, just the two of them, at a restaurant that was deliberately mid-range, Not a power move, but a neutral ground, a table where the point was conversation and not performance. Raymond had spent 3 days preparing for that dinner the way he used to prepare for major negotiations. He had thought carefully about what he actually needed to know, and he had stripped away everything that was really about his own comfort or reputation, and tried to locate the questions that were truly about his daughter's well-being. He arrived at 4 of them. He ordered sparingly. He waited until the bread had come before he began. The first question was, "If you lost your job tomorrow, what would you do?" Marcus said he would spend 1 day being upset about it, and then he would figure out what was next, because sitting still had never been an option for him, and he didn't plan to start. He said he had lost jobs before twice, once when a construction company went under, once when a logistics firm downsized, and both times he had found his way back to solid ground within a few months. He said he wasn't afraid of starting over, because he had done it enough times to know that starting over was not the same as failing. Raymond noted the answer, not for its content, but for the absence of defensiveness in it. The second question, "If Elise got very sick, I mean seriously sick, what would that mean for your life?" Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It would mean she's the job. Everything else adjusts around that." Raymond had not expected to feel the sting behind his eyes that he felt at that answer, and he blinked it away carefully. The third question, "If you are poor for the rest of your life, can you live with that?" Marcus almost smiled. He said, "I've been poor my whole life, Mr. Caldwell. It's not comfortable, but it's not shameful either. What I can't live with is being a man my wife doesn't trust or respect. That would be a kind of poverty I don't think I could come back from." Raymond put down his fork. He looked across the table at this young man in the clean but inexpensive shirt, and he asked the fourth question, the one he had not planned, but that arrived in his mouth, fully formed. "What if Elise earns more than you? What if she always earns more than you?" And Marcus looked at him with something that Raymond would describe later, to himself, in the quiet of his study, as radiant steadiness, and said, "Then I'll be proud of her every single day." Love isn't a competition to see who earns more. It's a decision to build something together, and you don't win that by out-earning your partner. You win it by showing up. Raymond drove home that night, a changed man, though he could not have told you exactly which molecule had shifted, or at which precise moment the change had completed itself. Nobody had asked Marcus about his past in any serious way, because the people in Raymond's circle had already decided they knew his story. A man with limited means who had spotted a woman from a better world and angled his way toward her light. The truth, which Raymond learned in pieces over the following weeks from Marcus himself, from Elise, from a single brief conversation with Marcus's aunt, was both simpler and heavier than any of the narratives the room had constructed. Marcus's father, a man named Gerald Webb, had been an electrician. A good one by all accounts, reliable and skilled, and known in his community for doing honest work at honest prices. When Marcus was 23 and 3 months away from beginning a scholarship program at a business school that had accepted fewer than 4% of its applicants that year, Gerald Webb fell from a scaffold while working a commercial site where the safety protocols had not been followed. He survived, but the fall left him with a spinal injury that ended his ability to work and required sustained intensive care that insurance covered only partially. Marcus's mother, a woman named Dorothy, had a heart condition of her own. The math of their situation was brutal and simple. Someone had to stay, and Marcus was the someone. He deferred his scholarship. Then he deferred it again. Then the deferral window closed, and he let it go, with what his aunt described as a kind of terrible, private grace. He found work. He kept working. He cared for his father through several years of decline, sat with him through the indignities that serious illness imposes on a proud man, and held his hand in the hospital the night Gerald Webb died. Then Marcus grieved, and then because he was constitutionally incapable of stopping, he began again. He had been building himself back, slowly, and without drama, ever since. There was no inheritance coming, no lawsuit settlement, no hidden wealth waiting behind a modest exterior. Marcus Webb was exactly what he appeared to be, and what he appeared to be was a man who had been tested by life in ways that most of the people in Raymond Caldwell's living room could not have imagined, and who had not broken. Raymond's announcement to his family did not come immediately, because he was a careful man and he wanted to be certain he was acting from clarity rather than from the emotion of those evenings alone with his thoughts. But when the family gathering came a Sunday lunch at his sister Patricia's house, the kind of occasion where family business was traditionally conducted beneath the guise of polite conversation, Raymond had made his decision, and he was steady in it. It was Patricia who opened the subject, with the particular efficiency of a woman who had been waiting. She said, over salad, that she hoped Raymond wasn't seriously considering giving his blessing to this relationship, that she had nothing personal against the young man, but that there were practical realities to consider, that Elise had worked hard for the life she had, and a marriage should add to a life, not complicate it. Patricia's husband, a man named Glenn, nodded throughout. Elise's cousin Brandon, Patricia's son, 26, who had coasted through life on a combination of moderate talent and considerable family support, said, with a confidence that Raymond found remarkable given its source, "He's going to drag the whole family down. It's just math." And then something happened that changed the temperature of the room entirely. Elise, who had been quiet and contained through the whole lunch, the way she became quiet when she was holding something important very carefully inside herself, set down her fork and said, "Every single one of you is talking about bank accounts. Not one of you has mentioned who he is. Not one of you has asked what he's like to talk to at 10 o'clock at night when something goes wrong, or what kind of person he was when his father was dying and nobody was watching. You're measuring him in dollars, and you don't even know him." The table was silent. Brandon started to say something, and thought better of it. Then Marcus, who had been sitting beside Elise with his hands folded on the table, said quietly that he understood the family's concerns, that he would not ask Elise to choose between him and the people she loved, and that if his presence was genuinely harmful to her relationships with her family, he was willing to step back. He said it without self-pity. He said it as a statement of love, which it was. And Raymond, watching his daughter's face in the moment, Marcus said those words, and watching what that kind of selfless love looked like to a young woman who recognized it precisely because she had been watching for it her whole life, made his final decision with an absolute conviction that surprised even him. What Raymond had never told anyone, not Patricia, not his business partners, not even Elise, was the story of his own beginning. He had been 24 years old when he fell in love with Margaret, who had become Elise's mother. Margaret's family had money, the kind of money that had existed across several generations and had developed its own gravity, pulling everything around it into its orbit. When Raymond had come to ask Margaret's father for his blessing, he had been driving a car with 200,000 miles on it and earning a salary that Margaret's father described, with a flat generosity, as promising. Margaret's mother had not attended the dinner. Margaret's uncle had pulled Raymond aside afterward and told him, with what he clearly believed was helpful candor, that the family would be watching closely and that any difficulties Raymond encountered in providing for Margaret would reflect on all of them. Raymond had been measured, weighed, and found acceptable by the narrowest of margins, and he had known it, and he had spent the better part of a decade proving himself to a family that never entirely stopped measuring. He had succeeded. He had built his company, earned his reputation, purchased the house that the right people recognized, joined the right clubs, sent Elise to the right schools. And somewhere in the middle of all that proving, he and Margaret had grown so far apart that by the time they admitted it, there was nothing left to save. They had separated when Elise was 17, divorced when she was 19, and remained on civil terms because they were adults who loved the same person. But Raymond had never forgotten what it felt like to be the young man in the inadequate car, sitting across from a family that saw a spreadsheet where he had hoped they would see a human being. He had never forgotten, and yet he had very nearly made the same mistake. Standing in his sister's living room, he cleared his throat. He said, "When I was 24 years old, Margaret's father looked at me the same way some of you are looking at Marcus right now. I was the wrong kind of young man. Not enough money. Not enough history. Not quite the right address." The room shifted. Patricia looked at her brother with an expression that moved through several stages before settling on something that resembled recognition. Raymond said, I want you all to imagine that her father had said no. Imagine he had sent me away because I didn't have enough in my bank account. I wouldn't have had Elise." He paused. "That's the only measuring stick I care about." The gathering where Raymond made his formal answer was not theatrical by design, but it became so by the nature of what was said. He had asked Marcus and Elise to come to the house on a Sunday evening, and Patricia and Glenn were there, and a few of Raymond's oldest friends had been invited as well, not to serve as witnesses to a performance, but because they had been present at the beginning of this story, and Raymond felt, in some private and not entirely explicable way, that they deserved to be present at its resolution. The room arranged itself the way rooms do when they sense the approach of something significant. People found their chairs. Conversations softened. Arthur Langley was there, and he had the slightly diminished quality of a man who has been told a story that complicates his previous certainties. Derek Langley was not present, which Raymond had specifically arranged, because this was not about Derek, and he did not want the occasion confused. Marcus and Elise sat side by side on the sofa, their hands not quite touching, and Raymond stood by the fireplace, because it was his house, and he had always thought more clearly on his feet. He looked at Marcus for a long moment, at the same face he had first seen across his front doorway on that Saturday afternoon, steady and patient and entirely, unperformatively itself, and he said, "I've spent a great deal of time in my life around wealthy men. I know what they look like. I know what they sound like. I know what they're willing to do for money and what they'll let slide for convenience." He paused. "I also know what it looks like when a man has decided, somewhere in his core, what kind of person he is going to be, and has committed to that with no expectation of applause." Another pause, the kind that fills with its own weight. "Marcus, I don't need a wealthy man to love my daughter. I need a decent one." He extended his hand. Marcus stood, and Raymond felt the grip of a hand that had done real labor, a grip that was steady and real, and something in Raymond Caldwell's chest that had been tightly coiled since the day his own marriage had come apart released itself like a slow exhale. Elise made a sound that was almost a laugh and almost a sob, pressing her hand to her mouth the way she always had since she was a small girl, when something moved her past the capacity for composure. Patricia looked at the floor. Arthur Langley looked at his drink. Glenn surprised everyone, including himself, by saying, "Good, that's good." What followed was not a fairy tale, and Raymond was grateful for that, because he had lived long enough to distrust fairy tales. Marcus and Elise were married 8 months later in a ceremony that was modest by the standards of Raymond's world and felt, to everyone who was actually paying attention, like the truest thing any of them had attended in years. There was no elaborate venue, no orchestra, no imported flowers from overseas. There was a small chapel, a good meal, and the quality of presence in the room that only arrives when the people gathered genuinely love one another and are not performing for an audience. Marcus's mother, Dorothy, attended in a wheelchair, and she cried through the entire ceremony, and Marcus held her hand during the vows because he was that kind of son and therefore that kind of man. The years that followed were real years, the kind that contain all the ordinary difficulties that no wedding ceremony photographs. There were months when the bank account was uncomfortably thin. There were arguments, because there always are. There was a period when Marcus's truck finally gave up its long fight with entropy, and they had to share Elise's car for 4 months while they saved for a replacement, scheduling their days around each other's needs with the practicality of two people who have decided that logistics are not going to be the thing that defeats them. Marcus was promoted at the construction management firm where he had worked for 3 years, and then promoted again, and then hired away by a competitor at a salary that, while not spectacular, was real and growing and entirely his own. Elise received a significant promotion of her own, taking a senior director role that came with responsibilities she had been building toward for years. There was no moment where someone discovered that Marcus was secretly wealthy. There was no inheritance that arrived at the precise moment of maximum strain. There was only the steady, unspectacular, deeply human work of two people choosing each other every day, in the small ways that matter and the large ones that define you. What Raymond noticed, watching them over those years, was something he had not anticipated noticing. He noticed how Marcus treated Elise when things were hard. Not when they were easy. Anyone can be kind in easy times, but in the moments of friction, of disappointment, of the particular fatigue that settles on a person after a long season of difficulty. He noticed that Marcus never made Elise feel small. He noticed that when Elise was overwhelmed, Marcus did not attempt to fix what could not be fixed or minimize what was genuinely difficult. He simply stayed, present and steady, the way he had been in Raymond's living room on the first afternoon, the way he apparently always was. He noticed that when Marcus was struggling with a difficult project, with the occasional shadow of the life he had given up when he left his scholarship behind, Elise sat with him in that the same way, quietly, without trying to reframe it into something easier or more comfortable. Raymond had been to many dinner parties hosted by couples whose marriages had the surface quality of great success and the interior atmosphere of a cold building. He had watched people perform partnership in rooms full of guests who were themselves performing. He had almost never watched two people simply be with each other, without performance, without the management of image, with only the real texture of a life shared honestly. He watched Marcus and Elise be that, and it moved him in a way he had not been moved since Elise was small and used to fall asleep on his shoulder at the movies, trusting him completely. The people who had laughed that afternoon in Raymond's living room were not uniformly consistent in their later positions. Arthur Langley had the grace, about 2 years into the marriage, to find a moment alone with Raymond at a golf club and say, without looking directly at him, which Raymond understood was the closest Arthur could come to genuine humility, that he had perhaps misjudged the situation. Raymond said that was all right, and he meant it, because he himself had almost misjudged the situation, and he had no interest in building a monument to another man's error. Derek Langley eventually married a woman from Chicago, who was by all accounts an excellent match for him, and Raymond wished him well, and meant that too. Brandon, Elise's cousin, who had predicted that Marcus would drag the family down, went through a difficult period of his own in his late 20s, a failed business venture, a broken engagement, the kind of accumulated reversal that strips away the false certainties of inherited confidence. And it was Marcus who drove to Brandon's apartment one Saturday morning, completely unsolicited, and spent 3 hours helping him sort through the practical aftermath of things that had gone wrong. Brandon called Raymond afterward, and he did not try to minimize what that meant or coat it in humor, the way he usually did with things that affected him. He just said, "I was wrong about him." Raymond said, "I know," and there was nothing else that needed to be said about it. Patricia came around more slowly, with the careful, angled approach of a woman who finds directness physically uncomfortable when the direction involves admitting something she resisted. But she came around. She had seen enough of how Marcus and Elise lived their lives, the realness of it, the absence of pretense, the particular way a household runs when the people in it have actually decided to be there, and it had eroded her objections the way water erodes stone, not dramatically, but completely. The Thanksgiving table, a few years in, had a different quality than the Sunday lunch that had preceded Marcus's arrival in the family. Fewer performances, more actual laughter. The kind of conversation that can happen when nobody is managing anyone else's impression. Raymond noticed it and was grateful for it, the way he had become grateful in his later years, for the specific textures of things that were genuinely good, rather than merely expensive or impressive. Raymond Caldwell, in the years that came after, looked back at his life with the particular combination of clarity and tenderness that late experience makes possible. He had accumulated enough to be comfortable, and he had lost enough to know that comfort was not the same as contentment, and he had observed enough to understand the difference between a life that looked successful and a life that was. He thought about the men he had known over the decades, brilliant men, driven men, men of enormous financial achievement, and he thought about their marriages. He thought about the ones that had shattered under the weight of ambition, the ones that had hollowed out slowly until there was nothing but form and habit, where warmth had once been, the ones that had ended in the particular misery of two people who had built a great deal and lost each other somewhere in the construction. He thought about his own marriage to Margaret, which had been, at its best, a genuine partnership, and which had nonetheless not survived the accumulation of priorities that each of them had placed, year after year, above the priority of each other. He did not think about these things with bitterness. He thought about them with the interest of a man trying to understand something true about the world before he was done with it. He thought about Marcus. Not the idea of Marcus, not the lesson that Marcus represented, but Marcus himself. The man who showed up on time to every family occasion, who remembered what people mentioned in passing and followed up on it weeks later because he was genuinely interested, who had taught himself to cook because Elise had too many long days at work and someone needed to make sure dinner happened, who had called Raymond, once, from a hospital waiting room at 11 o'clock on a weeknight, because Elise had had a medical scare and Raymond was the person Marcus most wanted to talk to while he waited for the news. That call was, in its way, the clearest communication Raymond had ever received about what it meant to be trusted. He had answered it in a parking lot outside a restaurant, standing in the dark, and he had stayed on the phone with Marcus for 2 hours until the news came back and it was good. And in those 2 hours, he had known with absolute certainty that he had made the right decision on the right day for the right reasons, and that knowledge was one of the cleanest feelings he had ever had. There is a particular joy available only to parents, and it is the joy of knowing that your child is genuinely loved, not managed, not maintained, not kept, but loved with the full weight of another human being's real attention. Raymond had that joy, and he held it carefully, and he did not take it for granted. He thought sometimes about what he had said in that room of wealthy, skeptical people on a Saturday afternoon, that nobody had expected to become significant. My daughter doesn't need a rich man. She needs a good one. He had said it from some instinct that arrived faster than thought, some place inside himself that had been formed by everything he had learned about what endures and what dissolves, what builds a life, and what only looks like one from a distance. He did not think it was a wise saying. He thought it was simply a true one, the way the plainest truths usually are, obvious once you have lived long enough to stop mistaking the decoration for the structure beneath it. Money had its place. Of course it did. The absence of money was a genuine hardship, and he did not romanticize poverty or pretend that financial struggle was some form of moral purity. But money was a condition, not a character. It could be gained and lost and gained again. It could not substitute for the quality of attention a man brought to the people he loved. It could not buy the steadiness Marcus Webb had carried into that living room like a quiet light. The steadiness that had not flickered under ridicule, under pressure, under the specific cruelty of rooms full of people who had already decided what he was. A man could lose his income. He could lose his title, his status, his truck, his suit. He could start from the bottom of every conventional measure and still be, in the most important sense, exactly the kind of man you want beside your daughter at 11 o'clock on a dark night in a hospital waiting room. Raymond was in his late 60s when he told this story to a young man, the son of a colleague, newly engaged, anxious about a conversation he needed to have with his future father-in-law. The young man had asked Raymond how he had known, when Elise was young, what kind of husband to hope for her. And Raymond thought about it for a long moment, the way he thought about things now, without hurry, because he had learned that most questions are better for the patience you bring to them. He said, "I didn't know what to hope for when she was young. I had the usual ideas, stability, success, the things you can point to. But by the time Marcus walked through my door, I had been married and I had been divorced. And I had watched a great many marriages from the inside and outside, and I had started to understand that the things you can point to are mostly decorative. The things that actually hold a life together are harder to see. They show up in the small hours, in the boring moments, in the moments when nobody is watching, and there's no applause available, and the only reason to do the right thing is because you are the kind of person who does it." He paused. Marcus was that kind of person. I could see it in 30 seconds. Not because I was wise, because I had finally stopped looking at the things that don't matter long enough to see the things that do. The young man was quiet for a moment. Then he asked what Raymond had looked for, specifically, in those 30 seconds. And Raymond said, whether he was more interested in impressing me or in telling me the truth, because a man who'll tell you a hard truth in an uncomfortable room, he'll tell your daughter the truth too, in all the rooms that come after. And that's the only thing that will actually hold. On the evening that Raymond most clearly remembered, in the years that followed, he had been at Marcus and Elise's home for dinner. Nothing special, a Thursday, a weeknight, A meal that Elise had made and Marcus had cleaned up after, the easy rhythm of a household that had found its own pace. After dinner, Raymond had sat in the living room with a cup of coffee while Elise sorted something in the kitchen, and Marcus sat across from him, and they had talked about nothing in particular for a long time. Marcus had asked Raymond about a decision Raymond was making regarding his business, and Raymond had told him honestly what he was worried about, which was not something he did easily, and Marcus had listened and asked good questions and offered a perspective that Raymond had not considered and which turned out to be right. At some point, Elise came in and sat beside Marcus on the couch, and Marcus, without looking up from the conversation, put his arm around her the way people touch those they love when love has become as natural as breathing. Not a gesture, not a performance, just a fact of the body. Raymond had looked at his daughter's face in that moment, and she had been looking at Marcus with the expression that Raymond recognized from the very deepest part of whatever a parent is, as happiness. Not excitement, not satisfaction, not the temporary brightness of someone who has gotten what they wanted. Happiness, the settled, rooted kind that grows from something real. Raymond drove home that night, alone in his car on a dark road, and he thought about the Saturday afternoon years before when a young man in a worn suit had knocked on his door and asked for his daughter's hand. He thought about the room full of people who had already decided who that man was. He thought about what he had said and why he had said it, and what it had cost him in terms of other people's opinions, and what it had given him in return, which was everything. Money can buy a house, he thought, in the dark car on the quiet road, heading home to a house that was very comfortable and very empty and very much his own. But it cannot buy a man who remembers what he promised. It cannot buy the particular steadiness of a person who has been tested and has not broken, who has been offered the easy road and chosen the right one, who walks into a room full of people who have already dismissed him and does not flinch, does not perform, does not borrow someone else's idea of worth to replace the one he already carries. Raymond Caldwell, in his late years, considered himself a wealthy man in the ways that finally mattered. A daughter who was genuinely loved, a son-in-law who had told him a hard truth in an uncomfortable room and then kept every quiet promise he had made, and the memory of a single decision made from the best part of himself on an afternoon when he could have made the easy choice and didn't. That was the inheritance he was proudest of. Not the business, not the reputation, not the house, the decision, and the man he had trusted his daughter to, and all the ordinary evenings, warm and real and irreplaceable, that had followed. There is a version of Raymond Caldwell's story that ends with the handshake, with the moment of decision, with the clean arc of a man who saw clearly when it mattered. But the truth of any life is that the decision is only the beginning, and the meaning of it is assembled slowly over years of evidence that nobody sees all at once. Raymond understood this more deeply as time passed. The handshake with Marcus Webb had been the start of something, not the resolution of it. What came after was the actual substance of the choice every Sunday afternoon, every phone call, every moment in which the world offered Marcus Webb an easier version of himself, and he declined. There were times, in the early years of the marriage, when Raymond heard echoes of the old doubts in the voices around him. Patricia would make small comments, framed as concern, about whether Elise was taking on too much of the financial weight, about whether they were really building towards something or simply maintaining. Raymond listened to these comments the way you listen to weather, as information about the atmosphere, not as instructions for how to live. He had made his assessment, and the evidence continued to support it in ways that Patricia's anxiety could not account for. When Marcus's mother, Dorothy, needed to move from her apartment into assisted living, a transition that was both practically complicated and emotionally difficult, it was Marcus who managed everything, who drove every weekend to sort her belongings and coordinate the logistics and sit with her through the disorientation of being uprooted from the home of 30 years. He did this while working full-time. He did this without asking for recognition and without accumulating it as evidence of his own virtue. Dorothy told Raymond once, over coffee, that Marcus had never made her feel like a burden. She said it with such simple, unadorned gratitude that Raymond had to look out the window for a moment. He said that he believed her. He did believe her. The years had a way of revealing the architecture beneath things, and what Raymond observed in Marcus Webb's architecture was load-bearing where it counted. He observed it in small moments that accumulated into certainty. He observed it the winter Elise lost a colleague she had been close to, a woman named Sharon, who had worked alongside her for 6 years and died very suddenly, and the way Marcus moved through that week, canceling things without complaint, rearranging their life to make space for Elise's grief, cooking the meals she didn't ask him to cook, and sitting beside her through the evenings when she needed company without needing to talk. He observed it in the way Marcus spoke about his work, without grandiosity and without false modesty, as a man who had found a kind of satisfaction in doing something well and being depended upon, which was not a fashionable kind of pride, but was a genuine one. He observed it in the way Marcus treated the people who worked under him, once he had risen far enough to have people under him, with the particular consideration of a man who has been the lowest person in the room and remembers what that feels like. His crew at the construction firm spoke well of him, not in the performed way of people who want to impress a boss, but in the quiet, direct way of people who have actually been treated well and are aware of its rarity. Raymond thought, in his older years, about what it meant to actually see another person. He had spent much of his professional life cultivating the ability to assess quickly, to take stock of a room and its inhabitants in the first 60 seconds, to read the signals that told you who held what leverage and what they planned to do with it. It was a useful skill in business and a corrosive one in intimacy. He had assessed his way through his marriage to Margaret and had catalogued her qualities and her deficits with such precision that he had never once simply been with her, in the way Marcus was simply with Elise, present and curious and undivided. He recognized in Marcus something he had never managed himself in his prime years, which was the ability to give a person his complete attention without any residual calculator running in the background, tallying costs and benefits. Marcus listened to Elise the way people listen when they know that what they're hearing matters more than what they'll say next. Raymond had watched this for years. He never stopped being moved by it. There was a dinner, late in the decade, at Marcus and Elise's home. Their house was not large by the standards of Raymond's neighborhood, but it was carefully kept, and it had the quality of a home that is actively lived in, where every room contains evidence of real occupation rather than the staged calm of a place maintained for impression. Books opened and left face down, a half-finished project of Marcus's on the kitchen table. Photographs on the wall that were actual photographs from actual occasions, not decorative prints chosen to convey a lifestyle. Raymond sat in the living room after dinner, Marcus across from him, and Elise beside Marcus on the couch the way she always was. And Raymond looked at his daughter's face and thought, she is happy, in a way I did not know how to want for her, because I had not seen it. Not comfortable, not secure, not content in the managed, effortful sense of someone who has made peace with a diminished expectation. Happy. The word came to him cleanly, without qualification. She was happy, and Marcus was the reason, not because he had provided a life for her, but because he had made her feel, every day, that she was seen and real and worth showing up for. Raymond had given Elise many things over the course of her life. A good education, a certain kind of stability, the knowledge that she was loved by her father. But he had also, on one Saturday afternoon, in a room full of skeptical witnesses, given her the freedom to be loved the right way. He had looked at a young man whom the world had measured by its most superficial instruments and found insufficient, and he had used a different instrument, one calibrated by loss and regret and hard-won honesty, and he had seen what was actually there. That act of seeing, Raymond believed, was the most important thing he had ever done. Not the business, not the reputation, not the home. One moment of genuine perception, and everything that had grown from it in the years that followed. The realness, the warmth, the ordinary beauty of a life where two people had decided to be exactly who they were with each other and had somehow, miraculously, found that to be enough. A man, Raymond had come to believe, could lose almost everything the world uses to measure him. He could lose the job, the title, the address, the car that announces his place in the hierarchy of things. He could stand in a doorway, in a worn suit, with calloused hands, and a truck older than his ambitions, with nothing to offer except the truth of what he was. And if what he was happened to be a man who showed up, who did not break, who kept his promises in the small hours when no one was watching, and the only reason to do the right thing was because he was constitutionally incapable of doing otherwise, then he was, in the only sense that finally mattered, the richest man in the room.